Hello everyone and welcome to episode 12 of my beginner's guide to Kerbal Space Program. You know, over the past 11 episodes we've built a lot of vessels, and the one thing they've all had in common is they've all had Kerbals in them. Well, that changes today. Today we're going to build our first uncrewed vessel. I shouldn't get ahead of myself too much though, because first of all I need to have a mission for this vessel, and the mission is going to be to go to Minmus and to land on its surface. And this is going to be the first of a two-parter. This episode is going to be about the build, and the next episode is going to be about the landing. Anyway, let's go over what are the ideas we're going to be covering in this episode. Well, first off, we're going to be talking about the difference between building something that is a probe and building something that is crewed and how the two compare against each other. We're going to need to be thinking more about communication and antennas as well, and talking about those. We're also going to be talking about making sure we will know that our vessel is going to be capable of landing on the surface that we want it to land on. This is also going to be the first time we're going to be talking about fairings. So we're going to be talking about how to build the fairings and then how to tweak the fairings so that they will behave in the way in which you would like it to behave. And then finally we're going to finish off with a couple of more tips about building boosters. Yes, we're going to get more boosters in this one, but right now let's just get going. But before we get started here, I want to take a quick look into research and development just to show you that I have taken that science that I have earned of late and spent it. I've unlocked most of the next tier, so we're working our way up the tech tree, and mostly I'm looking at getting some of these probe parts. So let's jump to the VAB and get started here. Here under pods we have, well, first a couple of pods that we should be pretty familiar with. Mark 1 landing can, talk about that in a future. What I really want to take a look at are these two guys. These are our so far unlocked probe bodies. The first one you unlock is the Probo-Dobudyne Staputnik probe body, and the next one is the Probo-Dobudyne Octo probe body, and there's better probe bodies as you move your way up the tech tree, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between these two, because that will get into some of the differences we have to think about when we start building our spacecraft. I'm going to start with the Probo-Dobudyne Octo because I want to point out what the Octo has that the Staputnik does not. So we're going to right click on it to open up the full menu here. It has a command section which tells us that we're able to command this thing remotely, which is kind of what we want to do. It talks about data transmitting and KerbNet access. We'll talk about data transmitting very shortly in a little bit, but it's down here. I want to really draw attention to these two sections here. Number one, reaction wheels. Remember what reaction wheels do. They allow you to adjust the attitude, that's the orientation of your spacecraft, without having to rely in space, without having to rely on any kind of reaction thrusters or any kind of thrust at all. Very, very handy to have. They do not have a lot of torque, 0.3 kilonewtons. As a basis of comparison, if we take a look at the Mark 1 command pod, which we've used a fair bit, the reaction wheels here are 5 kilonewtons, so more than 10 times stronger. But for small probes, the 0.3 kilonewtons is actually perfectly adequate, perfectly fine. Below that, we see that it has SAS. It has a stability assist system. So SAS, that's that thing we toggle on during flight. We've used it in a number of videos. And not only will the reaction wheels allow you to change the orientation of your spacecraft, but the SAS system will keep it pointing in the direction once you're done orienting it around. It will hold it there for you. It does not have, though, the kind of lock to prograde, lock to retrograde types of buttons that we have used a little bit with the Mark 1 that our pilots actually have. So it's not quite as functional as actually having a pilot aboard. That comes later. But it does have that SAS system. If I compare that to the Staputnik, and I scroll, well, I'm already kind of down towards the bottom, you see there's no mention of reaction wheels. So it doesn't have reaction wheels, and it doesn't have reaction wheels. Well, shouldn't be surprised. It doesn't have SAS as well. So if you're going to use the Staputnik, you know, since it's the only one that you've unlocked, understand that this in space by itself is incapable of affecting its orientation. You can't turn it. Okay, what you are going to need to do is give it some means of attitude control. You can give it reaction wheels. For instance, these small inline reaction wheels will sit under there nicely, but even with that, it doesn't have SAS. So although you can use the WASD and the Q and the E keys to orient the vessel the way you want, it won't lock to that particular direction. It will continue to drift, and then you have to correct for that. It can be fun, but it is a bit challenging. So what we're going to do is we're not going to use this one. In fact, this is why I waited until this episode to start talking about uncrew. But we're going to use the Octo Probe Core with its SAS capabilities. All right, let's start building ourselves a little probe. Well, actually, before we get to that, let's talk about budget. Yes, we got to talk about, we're going to go to Minmus and we're going to land on the surface. How much delta V do we need? Talked about this a few episodes ago, so I'm going to go through this more quickly. We're bringing up our delta V map, and we can see the transfer from low Kerbin orbit to Minmus is 930 meters per second. So we need to put that on our budget. Now, you'll notice above the 930, there's this number 340. You see, Minmus is not in the same plane as Kerbin's equator, which is like what the moon is. So our transfer to Minmus requires a change of inclination, and this is the most you might spend on making that inclination change. And you might be saying to yourself, oh my gosh, if I'm gonna, I should add that on, right? That might end up having to spend that. No, you won't. I will show you a simple and effective means so that you don't have to make that 340 meter per second burn. We're going to talk about that next episode. So we're going to strike that from our list. We're going to ignore it. It doesn't need to be worried about. Instead, we're going to move on. 160 meters per second gets us our capture into low Minmus orbit. And then the next number is what it takes to land on Minmus, that 180 meters per second. Now, that 180 is assuming a very efficient landing. And when it comes to powered landings, I like to give myself, even though I've played this game for years and years, quite a bit of wiggle room, because powered landings, it's tough to do a super efficient powered landing. And if you under budget, well, you crash. That's the way it goes. So I like to add at least 25% to this number. So we're going to take that 180, add on a further 25%, and pump it up to 225 meters per second. And now if we add that all up, that gives us a total of 315 meters per second for our budget. We'll budget a little bit more than that as well, but that at least gives us a base value for which to shoot. Okay, let's start building this thing. Let's start putting on some fuel and some engines and see where we get. So we got some new fuel tanks that I've unlocked, and right here is the smallest fuel tank that we have available, the Oscar B fuel tank. And since it's going to be a small probe, we're going to start small. We're going to grab it, and it fits under here very, very nicely. Our Oscar B fuel tank, which is 22 units of oxidizer and 18 units of liquid fuel. Very, very small. And by the way, to give you an idea of the scale, here's a fuel tank that we've been using lately. I'll put that on top. Right, that gives you an idea of how small we are building these things. That's great. Okay, let's look at engines. We also have some smaller engines. We actually have some bigger engines, but right now I'm looking at the smaller engines. And in fact, I'm looking at this one, the LV-1 Ant liquid fuel engine, and we're going to plunk that down on the bottom. We're going to see what we're going to get, and we look down here to the bottom right and we see 680 meters per second. Oh, that's way short of our required 1350, but don't forget the default for this delta V is always like at altitude, right? And we're going to be doing all of this burning in a vacuum. And in fact, the Ant engine is a really bad atmospheric engine. If we take a look at it and look at its stats, remember it's ISP that tells you how efficient it is. At sea level, that's the ASL, it has an ISP of 80. But in a vacuum, it's 315. It is designed as a vacuum engine, and that's the way we're going to use it. So we're going to switch this to vacuum, and suddenly our delta V is up to 2,678. More than twice what we need, but we're not done building yet, but that's at least encouraging that maybe this is all we're going to need. Okay, up next, communication. That's something I haven't talked about too much, so we'll go down to the communication tab. And the reason why I haven't talked about it too much is because I haven't transmitted any science yet. Yet the plan with this probe is to put it on the surface of Minmus and leave it there. It's not coming back, so we're going to get science. We need to transmit it back to the KSC. The other thing as well is, in all of our previous vessels, we've had a Kerbal to fly the vessel. This one is going to be flown remotely, and in order to fly it remotely, you need to communicate with it. So let's scroll up to the 3 antennas that we've unlocked so far. I'm going to start with this one. Not going to use it, but there's one thing I do want to draw attention to. If we go to antenna type, this says relay. If I go to either of the other two, it says direct. So what's the difference? Well, a relay is, as the word implies, designed to grab a signal from some vessel and then relay that on to the KSC, or actually potentially to another relay. You can have relays going to relays as well. That is a topic all unto itself, a fascinating topic within the game. I'll stick up a link to one of the more advanced videos that I've done. But it's beyond the topic of what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about direct ones. We have the Communitron 16S and the Communitron 16, which have actually the exact same stats, actually except for the mass and its tolerances. The Communitron 16S is meant to be used inside an atmosphere. It's very tough. It won't break. Well, at least it's tough to break it. While the Communitron 16S is meant to be used outside, well, at least not while you're moving through an atmosphere, which is exactly what we're going to be using it for. Now, if I get down here, it talks about data transmission and ranges and things like that. Again, a topic that really is beyond the scope of this video. For Minmus, putting on 2 of these works fine, works great, in fact. If you're going to the moon, you actually only need 1. Again, up there on the right, popping up right now, is a video that goes over all the math, and you can take a look at that to your discretion. But all I'm going to do is grab 2 of these, and I'm going to stick on 2 of them. So we're going to toggle on the snap, we're going to put them on the top, 2-way symmetry. We'll stick them right there for now. Okay, so that's going to take care of our communication. Next, well, science, right? Science is next. We got to think about science. We do have the Science Junior and the Mystery Goo, but these work best when you bring them back home. You can transmit some data, but it's not a huge amount. So I'm not going to use them. They're quite a bit of mass with negligible gain. Instead, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the press map barometer, and we're going to use the thermometer. Okay, up next, electricity. Let's go to electricity. So we have here aux-sat volcanic solar panels for generating our electricity need, and I'm going to put on 4 of them. 4 will be more than enough, and yeah, that'll be fine. They're not the way, and it looks better too. Now, when this thing, if you can imagine it sitting on the surface, the sun could easily be overhead, not like at some 90-degree angle like this. So what we're going to do, and this is also going to be for looks, we're going to turn these 45 degrees. So we're going to use the rotation tool. We're going to take off the snap, and we're going to just grab this red circle, and we're going to rotate this until they look about 45 degrees, just like that. And then we're going to take the move tool and we're going to adjust their positions a little bit. So we're going to slide them up like that. We're going to pull them out a little bit. Ooh, that's looking all right, just like that. I like that. There we go. So there's our solar panels. We also need some electrical storage. I do have a new battery that I've unlocked, the Z200 rechargeable battery bank. Twice the storage capacity of the Z100. Note the 200 over the 100. We don't need a lot. We're gonna stick that under here. Sits nicely. There we go. We're starting to look at a probe. Notice our delta V is still over 2,000 meters per second. That is sounding good. The only other thing we need, well, we got to land it, don't we? We need to put on some landing legs. So we're gonna go here to the ground tab. We have used these on our airplane just in a most recent episode, but beside it we have the LT-05 micro landing strut. These are the smallest of the landing struts, but this is a small little guy, so should be perfectly fine. And let's see, we'll put on the snap, and you know what? I think 4s don't need that many. Oh, I'm gonna put 3 of them on here. Stick them on there like that. The one thing you want to make sure with your landing legs is that the pads of the landing legs are well below your engine bell. You do not want the engine bell hitting the ground first. You want the landing legs clearly hitting the ground first, so make sure you take a look at that. You also want to have a nice wide stance. These are looking pretty good, I think. Yeah, I'm kind of happy with them just the way they are. So we're going to right click on them, and instead of having them start we're going to have them start retracted rather than extended, so they're tucked up nice like that. And we'll extend them obviously when we go to land. Now this is starting to look like a probe, and this actually will work perfectly fine. This thing's serviceable right now, but I really find, and we'll talk about this more next episode, is having some lights on there really do help with landing, even when you're landing during the daytime, which we are fully intending on doing. So I'm going to go over to the utility tab, and up here at the top we have the Illuminator Mark 1. There's two different ones, the Illuminator Mark 2 and the Mark 1. They are exactly the same, it's just the shape. I'm going to pick the Mark 1, they're nice, they're roundy, I like roundy things. And we're going to stick them down here at the bottom facing downwards. This will help us land, you'll see that. And now we're going to get into aesthetic mode. We're going to grab these, and I'm just going to rotate them out like this a little bit. There we go. So that, you know, when I extend them, they kind of look like rabbit ears on a TV, and I have really just aged myself with that comment. There we go, there we go. There is our probe. So let's take a look at our stats. We have 1,642 meters per second. That's 300 meters per second more than our budget. That should be ample. That makes me feel good. I think this thing should go the way it is. I think it's great. But I also need to take a look at thrust to weight ratio. So down here, TWR says 0.42. Now, I've mentioned we've built orbital spacecraft before. Once you are in orbit, doing orbital maneuvers in space doesn't require a great large thrust to weight ratio. And in fact, for orbital maneuvering, 0.42 is more than adequate. It will do fine. But when it comes to powered landings, you need it to be more than 1, and actually quite a bit more than 1, for the body on which you are landing. So for instance, if we take a look up here at the top of our Delta V Tools window, we see the word body, and right now this is set for Kerbin. If I tried to land this thing on Kerbin, it won't go well. It cannot produce more thrust than the force of gravity that is on it. So that means it cannot stop itself from falling. So when it comes to landing, that's going to be a bad ending. But we're not landing this on Kerbin, we're landing this on Minmus. So if we click on the little down arrow there, we're going to switch this to Minmus. And relative to Minmus, our thrust to weight ratio is 8.41. It's way more than 1. It's way more than what we need. In fact, we might want to even be dialing this down as we get closer to Minmus. You want that number, I would say at least 1.5. I like it to get it actually closer to 2. Because you never know, while you're descending, you might need to do kind of an emergency deceleration. It's nice to have that extra thrust. But 8.41, way more than adequate. So this little engine's going to do us just fine. So here it is. This is our probe. Now what we need to do is get this thing into orbit. Okay, so we need to attach a booster to it. So we're going to go over here to coupling, where we'll find the TS-06 stack separator. It's a nice small size for a nice small probe. It will sit in there just great. All right, next, this is a really awkward shape that won't have fun being pushed through the atmosphere. We need to contain it within a shell, well, to protect it. Well, thankfully, if I go under payload, I have here the AE-551 Airstream Protective Shell, otherwise known as a fairing. And if I click on that and put it under here, we get ourselves a nice little base. But more than that, actually it was starting to build, and then I right-clicked by mistake, so I gotta right-click on it again, and we're gonna build a fairing. So as we go up, notice what's happening here. We're building a nice shell to go around it. Now, notice where it says place cross-section, right there at the top. Notice how it goes orange and white and green. You want it to be green. You do not want this shell clipping with any of the parts of your payload, and you might want to just adjust the camera to make sure that isn't happening. So I'm going around here. Oh, there we go. I'm looking for it to be green. It says place cross section, and LMB is left mouse button, so I'm going to click the left mouse button. Oh, it's not letting me. There it is. And then I can produce the next section of the shell. It can come up a little bit higher, right? We can come in a little bit closer because it's a little tighter here. We'll click another piece. We'll come up here to above the tops of the landing gears. Place another cross section, and you keep going. You can decide to fiddle with this as much as you want, and then when you get towards the top, it suddenly changes to closed fairing, which means you can close this off. Now we have a nice protective shell around our payload. Awesome. We're going to go through the other menu items that were there in a second, but what we want to do at this point is we do want to test this. So I'm going to give this thing a name, and not to break with precedent, this is going to be our 6th rocket. Here we go. Save that, and we're going to launch it. And what you want to do is make sure the fairing can go away cleanly. Sometimes it glitches with parts of the payload. It can be a little bit ugly. The fairing is attached to the bottom of our staging group, so all I have to do is stage, and there it goes. You can see it kind of breaks off into all these pieces. It broke off just fine. I like to call this the confetti deploy, but there's other ways to do it. Let's revert back to the vehicle assembly building. We're going to right click on the fairing base, and over here we have at the top the clamshell deploy. I really like the clamshell deploy. I'll show it to you. Well, let's actually show it right now. See how they break off kind of nice like that? Now sometimes the clamshell deploy can get a little bit glitchy. I'll show you some tricks in order to minimize that. One thing you can do is increase the force, especially if your fairing is really, really big. You'll probably want to do that. I don't think we need to here, but the other thing I like to do, I like to increase the number of sides. The more sides you put on it, I find the cleaner it tends to come off. I'm going to put this one on 3 sides. It's not a huge fairing thing. There we go. That's I think going to work for us really well. Then of course came time to build the booster, and as I already have a video on that topic, I'm not going to spend really too much time with this, other than to mention 2 new things. Let's take a look at a new part that I have. If I go under command and control, we've seen the small inline reaction wheels, but now we have advanced inline reaction wheels with significantly more torque and also a bigger size. We're going to take these and we're going to stick them right in here. This is going to make controlling this booster way easier, almost cheatingly easier if you were to ask me. Why did I put them, by the way, right there? Well, you actually, if I click on the center of mass overlay, it's good to get your reaction wheels as close to the center of mass as you can. That's the easiest place from which for you to turn an object. Imagine holding a long, thin object, maybe like a great big metal pipe, and you would like to turn its orientation. Well, if it's a big heavy object and you're just holding it by the end, it's hard to kind of lift it up and down and turn it. But if you hold it by the middle, it is much easier. Baton twirlers hold the baton in the middle for a reason, right? So put your reaction wheels in the middle of your rocket if you can do it. And you can see these are now very, very close to the middle. This is looking like a nice little rocket. Delta V again, well over 3,600 meters per second. Now, one last thing I do like to do here, I had the center of mass overlay on. I'm going to put on the aerodynamic overlay of what I call the center of lift. And you can see it kind of glitched in there very briefly and then it disappeared. You may or may not have noticed that. I still like to think about center of lift when it comes to rockets. We talked about this with planes a couple of episodes ago and how important it is for planes, but it is important for rockets as well. You want the center of lift to be well behind the center of mass. Right now, I'm not 100% sure where that center of lift is. I can probably get away with flying this thing as it is because of the very strong reaction wheels in the middle, but for minimal cost, I can grab the basic tail fins, I can put them down here towards the bottom. We'll put just 3 of them down here. And there's our center of lift right back there, or actually more appropriately the center of drag. And with that center of drag way behind the center of mass, this thing will have a natural tendency to fly just like an arrow. It's why you put, they have the feathers at the back of an arrow. You want the mass towards the front, the feathers towards the back. It keeps it orienting the way you want, often without you having to do anything at all. And I like that in my rockets. Oh, we're just down to final tweaks now. I'll put a link to the craft file in the description if you want to play around with this yourself. But we now have something that should be capable of getting ourselves into orbit, getting to Minmus, and landing on Minmus. That's what we're going to be talking about in our next episode. I hope to see you then.